When I first met my soon-to-be ex-husband, I thought I had hit the jackpot. He was undeniably handsome, effortlessly charming, and had a way of making me feel like the most special woman in the world. Our first few dates were straight out of a romance novel, filled with deep conversations, laughter, and thoughtful gestures that made my heart swell. I genuinely believed I had found my person. When we got married, we had a clear and mutual plan for our future. I would be the primary breadwinner and handle most of the household chores, while he would take on the responsibility of cooking and completing his bachelor's degree. It seemed like a fair and balanced arrangement at the time, something we both agreed upon with optimism. Except, he never actually followed through on his end of the bargain. Instead of attending class and dedicating himself to his studies, he spent his days glued to video games, skipping lectures without a second thought, and complaining endlessly about how miserable and unmotivated he felt. Before we tied the knot, he had been fun, affectionate, and present in our relationship. But after the wedding, it was like a switch had flipped. He withdrew into his own little world, one where I barely existed, and convincing him to have a date night became an exhausting, uphill battle. I felt like I was begging for his attention, for a shred of the man he used to be. Things in the bedroom took a nosedive, too. At first, intimacy became less and less frequent, and then, about a year and a half in, it stopped altogether. His excuse? I was no longer his type. Apparently, he had always preferred Kivya women, and at 120 pounds, I was simply not enough for him anymore. The irony was not lost on me. This had never been an issue before we got married. But suddenly, he was on a mission to get me to gain weight, dropping little comments about my size, encouraging me to eat more, as if molding my body into something different would miraculously fix our crumbling marriage. It made me realize something profound. Women often enter marriages believing they can change their husbands, but men do the exact same thing. I was not the woman he wanted me to be, and instead of accepting me for who I was, he made it painfully clear that I needed to change to suit his tastes. It was an exhausting and soul-crushing realization. I wanted to confide in my friends, to talk about the deep hurt and resentment brewing inside me, but I could not even bring myself to say the words out loud. How do you tell people that the man you married, the man who once adored you, now barely looked at you at all? There are no words in our society to describe a woman trapped in a sexless marriage. There is no catchy phrase or cultural shorthand for a wife whose husband refuses to touch her. I was probably the only late 20-something woman in my entire state who had to beg her husband for sex, an irony that gnawed at me every single day. From the start, my marriage was burdened with a problem that had no name, a silent affliction that felt impossible to explain. I had always believed, perhaps foolishly, that marriage was supposed to relieve sexual tension, not create it. After all, was that not part of the point? I did not say, "I do," with the expectation that I would spend my nights staring at the ceiling, wondering why my husband preferred video games over intimacy with his wife. At first, I clung to the routines that made us feel like a normal couple. The home-cooked meals he once took pride in making for me dwindled from a nightly ritual to an occasional effort, then to once a week, then not at all. He always had the same excuse. He was depressed. And maybe he was, but that depression extended beyond just skipping out on dinner. He stopped coming with me to family gatherings, avoided social events, and left me to show up alone to every wedding, every holiday, every birthday party. It became a running joke among friends. Where was he this time? Was he sick? Working late? No one could understand, and I had no real explanation to offer. I did not get married to live like I was single, to always be the odd woman out in a room full of couples. But I was patient. I told myself it was his mental illness, not our marriage, That was failing. I took on the role of caretaker, protector. I learned to hide anything in our home that could be a danger to him when his talk of suicide became more than just an empty threat. I held my breath every day when I walked through the front door, dreading the possibility of finding him gone, of finding him dead. The worst of it was the night he told me he was leaving, walking out the door and never stopping until he collapsed somewhere, alone. I stood in front of that door, blocking his way, refusing to let him leave. I called 911 with shaking hands, but before the dispatcher could even ask for my address, I canceled. He'd promised me he would not hurt himself, at least not while I was at work, and I clung to that promise like it was the only thing keeping me upright. My handle on this forum is not just for show. Our life together was like a soap opera, an endless, exhausting emotional roller coaster. One day, he would pull me close, craving comfort, seeking warmth. The next, he would push me away, his voice sharp and full of anger. I never knew which version of him I was coming home to, whether he would reach for my hand or slam the bedroom door in my face. Every day was a gamble, and every night, I fell asleep knowing I would wake up to yet another round of chaos. I walked on eggshells every single day. It did not matter what I was doing. One wrong move, one offhand comment, and I could set him off. One evening, I was simply washing dishes, lost in my own thoughts, when he stormed into the kitchen, his face red with fury. "I am going to become an astronaut," he announced dramatically. "And if you do not support my dream, I am cutting you out of my life." I stood there, my hands still covered in soap suds, staring at him in disbelief. He was 28 years old, had yet to earn his bachelor's degree, and spent most of his time playing video games. The idea of him becoming an astronaut was as far-fetched as me waking up one day and deciding to become a brain surgeon. But I had long since learned that reasoning with him was pointless, so I bit my tongue and said nothing. Eventually, I managed to convince him to seek professional help, and to his credit, some of his worst behaviors began to subside. The explosive outbursts became less frequent, and the reckless, impulsive proclamations started to die down. But whatever connection we once had, whatever love had once existed between us, was long gone. At that point, I did not feel like a wife. I felt like the exhausted mother of a moody, rebellious teenager. His mood swings went beyond the scope of normal bipolar disorder, beyond what even therapy could fix. He did not want a wife. He wanted a mother figure who would nurture him endlessly but never hold him accountable. And looking back, I could not help but think that his childhood had shaped him into this. His own mother had abandoned him at 14, leaving him to be raised by distant relatives in a foreign country. Perhaps, on some level, he had spent his entire life looking for a replacement. The actual end of my marriage did not come the moment I discovered the sexually explicit messages he had been sending to one of his community college students. By then, he had managed to land a part-time tutoring job, and apparently, that position had given him access to women who found him charming. But even then I stayed. The end did not come a few months later, either, when he boldly announced his plan to leave me for another woman, one who, ironically, wanted nothing to do with him once he was free. No, my marriage truly ended the moment I heard the front door creak open one evening, and my immediate thought was, "Oh crap, he is home." That was the moment. Long before I had any proof of his affairs, before I knew what he was doing behind my back, my body had already recognized what my mind refused to admit. I did not love him anymore. I did not feel safe. I did not feel happy, and I did not want to be around him. But I had been raised in a household where divorce was not an option. It was seen as a failure, an embarrassment, something to be avoided at all costs. So when I confronted him about the texts, I did something that still baffles me to this day. I forgave him. I convinced myself that we could work through it, that we could somehow fix what was broken. Ultimately, he made the decision for me. He left me for the other woman, though his grand plans did not work out as he had hoped. But by the time he walked out that door, my heart had already let go. And for the first time in years, I felt something I had not felt in a long time: relief. So there it is, the grand finale of my disastrous marriage. I had poured years of my life into supporting this man, both financially and emotionally. I worked tirelessly to keep us afloat while he sat around, wallowing in self-pity, making empty promises, and playing the victim. And how did he repay me? By tossing me aside the second he thought he had a better option. It was almost comical how predictable he was. The moment he believed the grass was greener elsewhere, he bolted, leaving behind the woman who had carried him through his failures and self-inflicted misery. And if that was not ridiculous enough, the man actually had the audacity to ask me for a parting gift, a flat-screen TV, as if I owed him a farewell prize for years of emotional exhaustion, neglect, and betrayal. Before he could even finish his pathetic request, I shot him down. My parting gift, I told him, was the fact that I had not channeled my inner Lorena Bobbitt after discovering his cheating. He did not appreciate the joke, but then again, he never had much of a sense of humor unless it was at someone else's expense. But his shamelessness did not stop there. He had one final request, one last favor to ask of the woman he had lied to, gaslit, and emotionally drained. He actually had the gall to ask if I could vacate my own condo, the home I paid for, whenever he wanted to have his little romantic evenings with his mistress. He truly thought I would just step aside so he could play house with another woman in the very place where I had built a life for us. My response? I told him to boil his head, take a long walk off a short pier, and then go F himself. Some people are so deluded, so far up their own asses, they genuinely believe the world revolves around their desires. That was when it hit me how much I had given up for him, how much of myself I had lost in the process. Slowly, my self-respect was returning, piece by piece. For years, I had bent over backward to accommodate him, to keep the peace, to convince myself that things would get better. But in the end, there was nothing left to give. I was done. And even though, due to some bizarre legal circumstances, he ended up getting the condo, I did not care. I would have signed over the damn deed myself just to be free of him. There is no price too high for freedom, and losing a home was a small price to pay for getting my life back. My traditional upbringing had utterly failed me. I had been taught that marriage was sacred, that loyalty and patience would fix all problems, that women were supposed to be caregivers, nurturers, supporters. But none of those lessons had prepared me for the reality of being married to a leech, a man who saw me as nothing more than a safety net until something better came along. I had wasted years trying to be the perfect wife to someone who did not even deserve my kindness, let alone my devotion. So I have made a decision. When this whole COVID-19 mess is over, I am done with traditional relationships. I am sticking to escorts. At least they will actually do the job they are being paid to do, rather than expect me to work full-time, come home, cater to their every whim, and pretend I am grateful for the privilege. They will not lie to me about seeing other women, because that is literally part of the deal. And best of all, they will have zero power to strip me of my home, my assets, or my dignity. And with that, my story ends. Finn.